My name is Alex. My stepfather stole my childhood. He did it with a smile and sharpened sentences. He never raised a fist. That wasn't his style. He carved a line down the middle of my life and invited everyone to ignore the left side. My mother believed him because he learned how to sound like truth. He learned patience the way others learn a trade. He learned how to bury someone alive without leaving evidence. When I was 12, he moved in. He called himself a helper. He called my mother by the name she used before she had to cough through the lies. Honey. He taught our house a new rhythm, his schedule, his rules, his shorthand for disappointment. I hated the sound of the front door when he came home, the way it announced him, satisfied and owning. He would walk through the hall like he was stepping onto a stage, and everyone else was there to applaud. The first thing he took was my room. Not by force. He sat me down and told me I needed to be more realistic. He said boys who stayed up too late got hurt by life. He painted my walls a neutral beige, for resale, and told my mother the carpet was a safety expense. I left for nights at friends' houses until the house felt like a hotel, and then I left for the street. When I came back, the mattress was gone, replaced by a leather chair and a lamp that threw light at him, not at anyone else. He took my voice next. He rewired the little things, the way my mother answered me, the tone she used. He called me selfish for wanting to go to college. He called me ungrateful for wanting to move out. He learned how to make me apologize for things I didn't do and to make my mother say I had already said sorry. He invented a narrative. I was difficult. I was a problem. He was the man who handled problems. He was the only one who could. By 18, I had a plan to leave. I got a job at a warehouse. I slept on couches. I learned to lick my injuries and move on. I closed my heart to asking for anything. I moved 2 states away and let the distance become sharp and clean. I told myself it was enough. It wasn't. 5 years later, my phone lit up with a message that did 2 things at once. It told me he had opened a business, and it told me my mother had been so supportive. The message was a picture of them at a small ribbon cutting, smiling like a couple that had won. He wore a suit that fit him like a second skin. He had found someone to believe him again. He had consolidated his power into a company. That image burned in me more than any of the old arguments. It wasn't the business. It was the fact that he had turned himself into something durable. He'd taken the house, the marriage, my mother's laughter, then he had learned to monetize it. He took people's trust and wrapped it in a name and a bank account. He sold ease. That night I drove until the roads blurred and pulled over at a 24-hour diner. I ate a burger and moved my hands around a cup of coffee as if it were a detonator. I told myself I was past wanting to hurt him. I told myself I wanted distance, not revenge. But my hands did not listen. The old anger sat like a stone under my ribs and pushed. I began to watch. You learn your enemy by their little predictable things. He was a man of patterns, morning coffee at the same cafe, the same bent of his head when he lied, the same set of friends who nodded for him because he paid them well. He moved through the world calculating gratitude like currency. I took notes. I kept a small spiral notebook in my back pocket, the same kind of cheap thing I carried when I was 19 and didn't trust mattresses. I wrote down his habits, who he talked to, where he deposited checks, which bank never asked questions, which contractor always showed up on Tuesday with a clipboard and a smile. Details are the soft underbelly of a man who thinks himself invincible. My revenge wasn't going to be loud. Loud is messy and attracts cops and cameras. Loud feeds tabloids. I wanted something surgical. I wanted the kind of damage that leaves a man looking at his hands and not recognizing the person who owns them. First rule: use his strengths against him. He believed in paperwork. He worshipped receipts. He built walls of contracts and signatures and licenses around himself like armor. That meant there were seams. Paperwork reveals lies if someone is willing to read close enough. Second rule: be boring. He would never suspect the man who watched the paint dry. He expected fireworks, not a long, calculated erosion. Third rule: never touch the things that could put me behind bars. No theft, no threats, no assault. I wanted him ruined, not martyred. I wanted him alive and reduced, not dead or hidden from who he once was. I started with the clients. He had local clients, small ones, businesses that trusted his friendly charm more than checks. I began to whisper corrections into their ears. I used email addresses he didn't recognize. I sent polite notes. I thought you might want to check the terms. Sometimes clauses like this can be costly. I pointed out regulatory changes that would affect his company. I made spreadsheets and sent them as attachments, full of public records and ugly little lines that his cheap accountant would either ignore or fail to see. Some of them called me on the phone. They asked who I was. I lied. I said I was a consultant. I said I was a concerned former partner of someone he'd poached several years ago. I used names that had once been true, and then I let them imagine the rest. They called him. They asked about compliance. They asked about insurance. He smiled and promised. He invited them to his office. He sent them the same slick brochure that made him look like a man who had thought of everything. He was good at that. He could wave doubts away with an invoice and a handshake. But a few of the clients did what people do when you throw a pebble at a pond: they watched the ripples. They looked closer. One of them discovered that the certification he'd showed them existed only in a pile of scanned pages with a faint watermark that no Rio registrar used. Another found that his insurance policy had a missing clause. A third learned that the contractor he hired had a history of skipping permits. The dominoes were slow. That was the point. Each one toppled because he was man-made and his machine was not flawless. I learned the intimate truths by listening to the people he needed to perform for, my mother foremost. She was the one he had to keep peaceful. Love for her was his leverage and his lie. I started appearing at appointments he couldn't be bothered to attend. I brought flowers my mom could afford on her own now, and I made small talk that was safe and unthreatening. I became a ghost in the life they were building. I would be at the post office when a package arrived. I'd show up to a neighborhood sale and buy a lamp she loved so he couldn't gift it to her later under his name. Small slaps. They should have been meaningless, but they were precise. There's a cruelty in returning a man's illusions to him piece by piece. He had constructed this identity: husband, businessman, benefactor. I collared those names like trophies. I did not break him in one night. I turned the lights off in rooms he had never noticed were lit. One afternoon I sat in the cheap seats behind his public speech at the community center. He spoke about giving back. He wore the smile of a man who has rehearsed his conscience. The crowd loved it. My mother sat in the front row, clapping with a handkerchief to her face. I watched him say things about family values and community strength, and my mouth went dry. It was like watching a man perform a funeral for someone who was still alive. Afterward, I followed him to his car. He talked to 3 people at once, shaking hands and promising lunches. I watched him sign a book for a small child like a man who had secrets to keep. I took a photo of his license plate. Later, when I mailed a packet to his business address, I used that photo to send a carefully worded legal notice about zoning infractions addressed to Mr. His name, CO. The notice was the kind that brings men to meetings and forces papers to be opened. He started to look tired. That was the best part. He had been a man who slept like a king. Now he tasted worry at night. Pride is thick. Once it begins to flake, it makes a mess. I kept twisting at the edges. Gentle erosion is also economic. Reputation is capital. I turned his currency into digits on a screen. I filed complaints. I called regulators. I found names of clients who'd been burned before and reminded them of the small victories they had forgotten. I wrote to local newspapers with leads thin enough to be plausible and thick enough to be worrying. He paid to smooth things. He bought loyalty with discounts, with dinners, with a flare of charm when it mattered. He hired a lawyer. He spent thousands on consultants who told him the same thing. We can fix this. It was expensive, but he had money. For a while. Money is porous in the lives of men who built on smoke. I was patient. I had little cash, but I had time. I set up a shell of lies that were legally clean, a blog that tracked small local business compliance, an anonymous tip line for concerned citizens, a string of tax filings that showed nothing illegal but had small inconsistencies that begged for audits. I didn't lie on a form in a way that would land me in prison. I filled forms with inconvenient truths that would make auditors ask real questions. I watched as inspections arrived. I watched him try to charm a state inspector, and watched the charm fail because charm doesn't fill permits. When the regulator asked for certain certificates, he turned white and stumbled and promised to fax them later. The auditor left, and the auditor's file grew. The clients I'd nudged away stopped giving him the benefit of the doubt. When you are a man who relies on favors and smiles, losing a single favor can be lethal at the edges. He lost a big client. The contract was not enormous in value in the national scheme, but in his world it was one of the pillars. He promised to cut costs, to lower his margin, to get creative. He took loans. He started to make personal guarantees. He signed things with a hand that trembled. My mother paid with quiet worry. She started to skip trips to the hairdresser. She stopped buying the luxury cereal he liked to show off when he announced, "We're celebrating." Their dinners at home became less theatrical. She laughed less. It was not enough for me to watch him lose money. Money is anonymous. What I wanted was to take away the little things that made him feel like he had always been more than he was. I wanted him to see the floor drop under him and to fall not into darkness, but into mundane, humiliating suffocation. People always underestimate a small town's appetite for spectacle. A whisper becomes a rumor, goes to a column and then to the coffee shop and then back into the ears of the man who created the whisper. I did not invent a scandal. I connected dots that were already there and let others draw the picture. There was a charity gala he loved to attend every year, a place where men in suits bought tables and bought praise. He prepared that gala as if it was his coronation. He bought overpriced wine and a tailor who whispered that the man's suits should look like monuments. 2 days before the event, I sent anonymous emails to the gala committee, not accusations, just questions. Did you check his corporate filings? Is the insurance current for his events? The emails were clinical. They did not scream. The committee, being human, panicked in a reasonable way. They asked. They prepared meeting agendas. The gala director called a special session to vet sponsors. When they called him into a room with the gala director and the volunteer treasurer, he walked in smiling, the perfect smile. He left pale. Someone had photocopies of permits. Someone had an email trail that showed an unpaid invoice. Someone had a letter from a client who had left because his company had missed a deadline and then blamed the client. The gala removed him as a sponsor. He was not accused of fraud. He was quietly excluded. The gala program printed a new list. His name was missing. The program was small and official, and no one else noticed except our town. The paper was folded in half and tossed into a bin, and the bin smelled like melted candles and sugar. He sat at home and stared at his phone and could not understand why a roomful of people he'd paid weren't on his side. He called my mother, and his voice did a thing I had never heard before. It trembled, not in anger, but with desperation. My mother, who had stood for him like a shield at one time, listened and then pressed her hand to her mouth as if to quiet something that had started to rumble inside her chest. I had not sent a single public accusation. I had not filed a legal complaint that would land him in court. I had only made sure the right people read the right papers in the right order. It felt like the work of a seamstress unpicking a tuxedo. There is a slow violence to ruin. It does not feel cinematic because there are no screams. There is only a gurgling sound like someone trying to breathe through bitterness. He began to check his messages with a different face. He stopped answering unknown numbers. He argued with his staff and then paid staff to stay quiet by overworking them. The men who had once nodded at him no longer laughed at his jokes. A man who lives on nods will find his days long when the nods stop. Business creditors called. He refinanced. He sold assets quietly: a company car, a piece of land, a painting he'd bought at an auction he never understood. Each sale made him a little poorer in pride. At home it was worse. He started to attack the edges of my mother's freedom. He said things about tight times and sacrifice that framed their lives in numbers. He asked her to postpone dental visits. He made the electricity bill his line of argument. I watched her budget with a calculator like a woman trying to construct a life out of a few frayed threads. At night he paced. Once I saw him standing by the window of their bedroom as if the outside world might hand him back the applause. Sometimes he whispered to himself. He tried to carry on like a man with a plan, but the plan had too many debts and not enough faith. Then the inspector returned. This time the penalty was real, a fine for an oversight he had once dismissed as clerical. The amount staggered him. He called his lawyer, and the lawyer had the look of a man who had been paid too long to be surprised. They argued about options, about payment plans, about selling the house if it came to that. He called my mother and cried on the phone, not to her pity, but because he had no other place to unload the weight. He knew I would hear. The longing in his voice smelled like a man who had reached his limit. I did not gloat in anything loud. I drank alone and walked the neighborhood and watched a man kneel beneath his own stories. The end was not a scream. It was the closing of a door that had once been left open. He sat at the kitchen table with the newspaper folded and his eyes on the classifieds. He looked older than his 50 years. He had lost his color in a way money cannot buy back. My mother asked him one night if he wanted to sell the house. He told her no. He told her they would pull through. She smiled at him with a small tremor of pity and then turned the television off and went to bed. 2 months later the bank called. The bank that had once considered him a pillar sent letters that used the language of formality and inevitability. He made arrangements that required signatures and collateral. He signed with a hand that shook. I watched him file for bankruptcy. He sat in a small office and folded the forms like a man folding a map to a world that no longer existed. The words on the papers were clinical: liabilities, assets, discharge. The court docket read like a paragraph of oblivion. He had not been accused of theft or crime. He had only been undone by the ordinary arithmetic of obligations he could no longer manage. When the bankruptcy was public, he stood on the porch and watched the neighbors look at him differently. The nods came back, but they were small and careful. People who had once invited him to their tables now offered condolences at grocery store checkout lines. There is a language of pity that lands like salt. My mother left after that. She could not live in a house where every argument was an accountant's ledger. She took the savings she had been hiding for years and bought a small apartment across town. She called me and said, "I'm free." Her voice was both exhausted and clean, like a sheet that had been washed and hung in sunlight. He went to court appointments. He sold the suit he'd used for the gala and never had a reason to wear another. He applied for jobs at companies he used to patronize. He lowered his head at interviews and used the script of a man willing to do anything. He mailed resumes that had once been thin with possibility and now read like apologies. I never wanted him in a ditch. I wanted him visible. I wanted him to feel the shape of what he had done. I wanted him to lose the comfortable cloak of respect. I wanted my mother to leave him while she still could. I wanted him to wake up in a small house and count expenses and taste humiliation in the corners of coffee. When he called me to ask for a meeting, a proper sit-down like a man who has not broken his own rules, I went. He looked brittle, honest in a way that had nothing to do with contrition. He asked me if I wanted anything from him. He said, "Tell me what will make you sleep at night." I told him, "I want you to work for something. I want you to feel the grind you forced on my life. I want you not to be able to buy your way out of the truth." His jaw clenched. He tried to bargain. He offered money like the old way people buy apologies. I refused. Money was the old language and I had hungered for a different word. He started to send small bills for my mother. He said it was a joke. He said it was charity. My mother turned them down. She did not want charity from the man who had kept her young and then catalogued her faults. She wanted the simplest thing, to be out of the theater. His life tilted into quieter survival. He took jobs that required early mornings and late nights. He learned to cook in small portions. He watched prices. He took the bus to a job interview and sat beside young men who smelled of ambition. Sometimes I would see him across a supermarket aisle and he would look away. Once he saw me and stopped in his tracks. He lifted a hand in a gesture that might have been apology or surrender. I kept walking. I did not want to meet him with the expression I had practiced. This is not a story with a neat moral. There is no catharsis that wipes clean the things he took. My childhood is still missing. Some nights I dream of the room he painted beige. I dream of the childhood I should have had and the voice I should have used. I have my own small home now. I have a bed with sheets I paid for. I have a job that pays enough. I sleep without the weight under my ribs most nights. He calls sometimes, a number I don't pick up. Once he left a message. If you ever need anything. And then he stopped, and I heard papers rustle. The message was empty as an envelope. He writes me emails that are polite and small. He has tried to rebuild in the margins. He goes to church sometimes and sits in the back. He reads the paper when he can afford it. The last time I saw him properly was on a cold day in late November. The town had that brittle light that makes everything look old. He was on the corner, carrying a box of things to donate. He looked diminished. He had lost the softness of his old arrogance. It had been replaced by something that was almost decent. He raised his head when I passed, and our eyes met. For a second he looked like a man who had learned a hard lesson. For a second I felt nothing but a quiet emptiness. I did what I came to do from the beginning. I unstitched his life without drawing blood. I left him alive, with days that would be measured in bills and small work, and the ache of watching a house become someone else's memory. He calls his existence now a second chance, when others ask. He does not say what he lost, and he does not say what he took. He can barely make ends meet. He is not dead. That was the point. This is where the story ends, not with forgiveness or a lesson, but with the truth. Some things can be taken back, some things cannot. He knows the difference now, and the quiet ways men learn. I know it too. There is no sermon here, no tidy closure. There is only the knowledge that I returned a measure of balance, and the knowledge that balance is not mercy.